Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. World Championship Boxing, big money golf tournaments, marquee football internationals. Just some of the recent sports events being hosted in Saudi Arabia. There have been calls for players to stay away over the country's human rights record. Do sports boycotts work? You're watching Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Saudi Arabia stands accused of sports washing, staging high-profile sports events to apparently gloss over questions of human rights. Well, using sport to improve PR is nothing new, but sometimes sports stars follow their consciences and take a stand, and when that happens, it can change the world.
For boxing fans, it was one of the most anticipated fights of the year. Anthony Joshua's heavyweight fight against Andy Ruiz Jr. in Saudi Arabia last year was billed as the clash on the dunes. It was the first heavyweight title contest to be staged in the Middle East, but it was also controversial. Condemned as an attempt at sportswashing by Saudi Arabia, whereby using high-profile sports events to distract from accusations of human rights abuses. From its coalition war on Yemen that has resulted in the deaths of more than 10,000 civilians to the grisly murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and its crackdown on female and human rights activists. Sportswashing isn't a new phenomenon. Nazi Germany held the Berlin Olympics in 1936. Argentina's junta regime hosted the Football World Cup in 1978, and apartheid South Africa attempted to stage multiple sporting events despite international sanctions. The government there was hit by several sporting boycotts over the years as teams or star players chose to stay away. And female golfer Megan McLaren recently decided not to play in a tournament in Saudi Arabia in protest. So should we be concerned about the ability of some regimes to cleanse their reputations through sport? And could sports boycotts be the solution?
And I'm very pleased to welcome to the table John Taylor, former Wales rugby union player and commentator. John refused to tour with the British and Irish Lions in South Africa in 1974 due to the apartheid regime. With me also at the roundtable, James Lynch, co-founder of Fair Square, which provides specialist research and advice to help prevent human rights abuses. And we cross to the west coast of the United States. Jules Boykoff, their professor of political science at Pacific University in Oregon, former professional soccer player who represented the US at the Olympics. Welcome to you all. John, before the package, I said somebody doing this, boycotting an event, can change the world. I'm not suggesting that you think you did bring down apartheid, but were you part of that by saying, I refuse to go to South Africa?
I think that was an instance where it did help change the world, because I'm absolutely convinced that white South Africa, if it had its cricket and its rugby, the two huge sports in South Africa, providing it could play those sports where it was a powerhouse in the world. You know, the Springboks were recognized as being one of the 2-3 strongest teams in the world. If they could continue with that and that went on, life was pretty good in South Africa, and they would have carried on in that way. I mean, apartheid laws were actually getting stronger. They weren't weakening, they weren't gradually being eroded. It was a very, very tough time. And of course, I did go to South Africa.
You'd been previously, hadn't you? And you hated what you saw?
1968, I went with the Lions, but I was a school teacher in a big multi-ethnic, multi-racial school in Putney in London. 2,200 kids of all shapes, sizes, colors, and origins. And I actually, when I realized what apartheid was like on the ground, I felt I was letting them down.
You were with a tour party of what, probably 30 who went to South Africa in 68. Were you a lone voice in this?
I was, yeah. In fact, I remained a lone voice too all the way through. The rugby mantra was, we're not supporting apartheid, we're building bridges. But when we got there, I mean, I was immediately aware this was the biggest load of nonsense that I'd ever heard. And I actually had an old school friend who was doing a master's degree in Johannesburg. He was actually teaching kids in the basement of a Methodist church there, and he opened my eyes further. And so the next time it came up, actually, was when the box in 69-70 came to Britain, and that was when I really made myself unavailable.
And there were massive protests on the streets. There were invasions of pitches by anti-apartheid demonstrators.
Absolutely. Peter Hain led a very concerted campaign. And I think, you know, the difference with some of the do sporting boycotts make a difference thinking that went into this tour was it was very designed to stop the tour. And in fact, it was a rehearsal because the Basil d'Oliveira stuff was going on at the same time.
We should point out to those who don't follow international or British sports, if you like, in a sense colonial sports, that's a cricketer who was not allowed to go to South Africa to play for England, even though he'd been brought up in South Africa.
Yeah, that was even more complex because he was what was then actually classified as a Cape coloured who'd grown up in the Cape province in South Africa. Because he couldn't play first-class cricket over there, had come over to Britain and made a huge mark and was left out of the side that was selected to go to South Africa originally in 1968, I think it was. And even though he'd scored 150 runs, which is a great scoring feat in cricket against the West Indies the year before, and then that gave the South African government the chance to turn around and say, when they did decide after lots of protests to try and bring him into the side, no.
He's not welcome.
He's not welcome.
Which again cemented the certain feelings of resentment that there were against the South African regime when it came to sport. James, I'll come to you in a moment to talk about the effectiveness. But Jules, I want to ask you this. John suggested that this particular sports boycott, although it was over a number of years and a number of different sports, was possibly more powerful than other sanctions against a country such as South Africa because of the way that the country was set up. So that presupposes that it is a very powerful vehicle for protest.
The boycott can be symbolically very powerful in particular instances, including the one that you're talking about right now. And we shouldn't minimize the courage that athletes showed to stand up to power in that situation. When you start to move outside of one particular sport into some of these larger sporting mega events like the FIFA World Cup or the Olympics, things become a little bit more complicated. And one thing I would say is, while I massively admire the courage of the athletes who stood up in rugby to the power system at that time, the unequal racist power system of apartheid in South Africa, there's little evidence that boycotts, when it comes to the Olympics, for example, have that kind of similar powerful effect. And if we want to think about some of these larger events, we need to think a little bit differently.
We're talking about this because there's a woman golfer called Megan McLaren, 25-year-old English woman, who has refused to go to Saudi Arabia because of what she sees as, she says, based on research of people like Amnesty International, I couldn't be comfortable being part of that process. And I wish sport as a whole looked through a lens deeper than what benefits itself. What difference do you think a decision such as hers could make?
Well, I mean, I think at the very least what it does, and I absolutely agree, I sort of, really praise the kind of commitment and bravery that people show when they take a stand like this, because it's not what the authorities want to see, it's not what the sporting bodies want to see, it's not what the sponsors want to see. And we've seen in many cases where people have faced really serious personal consequences. Obviously, Colin Kaepernick and those who supported him are perhaps the most, well-known.
Again, for those who don't follow American football, he was the guy that bent the knee.
Absolutely, to highlight sort of racial injustice and
in an NFL game,
and essentially has lost his income over a long period as a result, and faced a lot of personal backlash. And so I think that we really must salute that bravery. Now, in terms of impact, and again, I would also highlight the fact that we put her against Anthony Joshua the boxer who was recently gone to Saudi Arabia for a world title fight. And not only did he take part in a sporting event there, but he effectively participated in the government's public relations campaign. So I think, you know, whilst I'm sometimes loath to personally criticise people for taking part in sporting events in countries where there are severe human rights abuses, the very least you might ask is, please don't actually make the argument of that government themselves and support their narrative.
OK, let's go back to Jules. I wonder if people do this for themselves or for the bigger picture.
Well, I think it comes down to the individual athlete, what their motivations are. But I think if we take a step back and we think about the two forms of pushing back that we're talking about here, the latter with Joshua basically doing propaganda for Saudi Arabia, and the idea underneath it, at least, is that by engaging with Saudi Arabia, that you're helping move the conversation forward. But I think if we look at other examples where that kind of argument has been made, that by engaging with authoritarian powers, that it actually helps with the human rights situation in that country, the evidence is actually pretty thin. And I think if we look at China, for example, which in 2001, Beijing was bidding on the 2008 Summer Olympics, and Chinese bid committee officials promised that bringing the games to China would improve the country's human rights situation. The president of the International Olympic Committee, whose name was Jacques Rogge at the time, he agreed. He promised that staging the Olympic Games would do a lot for human rights and social relations in China. But despite those kind of rosy predictions that come along with engaging, the 2008 Olympics actually marked a pivot point for the intensified state repression. There's some people from Human Rights Watch that said that actually the Olympics were a catalyst for human rights abuses then, and things have not gotten better. Just look to what's happening right now with the ethnic Uyghurs and the intensification of their suppression in Xinjiang province, while the International Olympic Committee sits idly by. And yet, the Beijing was just awarded recently the 2022 Winter Olympics. And so I think that if we want to have kind of a serious effect, these athletes need to also have movements behind them that help them go to the root of power here, whether it's the International Olympic Committee, those who are running rugby, those who are running golf, those who are running the FIFA World Cup.
I want to ask you whether you did it, John, because you had simply a conscience or because you thought you could make a difference.
It was both. I mean, I was very shocked when I got there, and as I say, realized that the rugby mantra we were building bridges was actual complete nonsense. When you saw apartheid actually in action on the ground, you realized this was crazy. And you know, the very fact that there was no sporting contact allowed between the whites and the blacks and the coloreds and the Asians, and this really dreadful system. So that was one bit. So I felt conscience-wise, I can't have any part of this. But I very quickly, before I then actually had to make the decision about whether I was going to make myself unavailable for selection for Wales.
Which was the following year.
Yeah, the following year. I had made contact with the anti-apartheid movement over here. Peter Hain had become a bit of a confidant. And we got to this stage where I was convinced as well that, say, here was a chance to really do something about it. And I did utterly believe that if we could stop cricket and we could stop rugby, the two major sports, and I mean, in a way, I was ashamed of rugby and cricket because they were, if you like, the great traditional British Commonwealth Empire sports. They were the big news in South Africa for white South Africans. And the authorities in cricket and rugby would go out of their way and do absolutely anything they could to keep those sort of ties going.
I will ask you towards the end of the programme, you've got time to think about this, whether in fact you were slightly ashamed of yourself for not returning from that tour of South Africa when you'd seen what was happening and then making your stand the following year. But I want to ask you about 21st century sport and politics. When you see Megan McLaren pulling out of this golf event in Saudi Arabia, do you applaud her for doing it? Do you understand the consequences that she personally might face?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure consequentially that she will suffer hugely because she's a professional sportsman. I don't think they're into any disqualification because she's broken any rules. But I do think it's hugely important that if she feels in all conscience she cannot go there, that she does that and stands up and is counted, and I applaud her enormously for it.
What do you make of people who refuse to see the problems with human rights? I'll ask you this again in a moment. In Saudi Arabia, and say, listen, this has got nothing to do with me. I'm here to play golf. I'm here to do a boxing match, play football.
You're quite sheltered from it all. I mean, you're out there having a very, very good time. You are actually pursuing the pinnacle of your sport, and unless it's really for other reasons in some ways sort of opened up to you and you haven't made any you've done no real thinking about it beforehand, then you can very easily put it into the background.
Now, are these just pathetic excuses from people who just want to go out and earn a great deal of money and ignore human rights abuses?
Well, I think, the idea that sport, you often hear this line, sport is not political. Sport and politics are separate. I mean, I used to work in the British government, and I saw firsthand how untrue this is. Simply, I sat in a meeting with, between a foreign secretary and a prime minister, and they were talking about trying to get the World Cup. There was two countries, both wanted the World Cup. So governments have always been, right since the outset of these global competitions, the World Cup and the Olympics, integrally involved in them. And some of those governments have done that in a benign way, and some haven't. Very famously, of course, we know about the Berlin Olympics, Mussolini's World Cup. So these are... The phrase that sport is not political is something that's pushed at athletes, and activists who try to highlight problems. It's, of course, the governments are apparently allowed to kind of be highly political, and I think when you look at, say, where you look at, for example, some of the new powers who are investing in sport, whether that be the United Arab Emirates through buying Man City, Qatar through buying Paris Saint-Germain, hosting the World Cup. Why are they investing in that? It's because sport builds influence and connections. People care so much about sport, and that's very similar to what the South African regime, why it values.
The other bit that you get coming through all the time, and we were very conscious of it at the time, was, of course, business was ignoring all the human rights issues, and, government support of South Africa, British government support of South Africa and British trade with South Africa was a major... So there was a bit of feeling from the sportsmen as well of, well, hang on, why are we being singled out? Why us having to do this when everything else is carrying on pretty normally?
So let me throw this one to you, Jules. Should we vilify? Is it okay to suspect the motives of those athletes to go and take the bank account or fill up their bank accounts by going to these places? Should we expect them to be more than just a little bit naive about what's going on?
I think it's a really important question. For me, the responsibility should not fall on the shoulders of individual athletes. As Mr. Taylor was pointing out, high-level athletes have enough to think about, just training, getting ready. I always marvel when you have a high-profile athlete who speaks out on political issues in coherent, thoughtful, smart ways, because they got a lot going on in their lives to manage already. Sport is a full-time job when you're doing it at that kind of high level. I think where the responsibility certainly lies is with groups like the International Olympic Committee, with governments like the United States, where I'm coming to you from right now. That's where power lies. That's where the responsibility lies in the first place when it comes to picking these hosts. So I don't hold it against athletes for not speaking out. And I actually appreciate it very much when they do. And I'm also really impressed when they do.
Let's carry on with the Saudi Arabia theme. Therefore, it's okay for an athlete to go there and take the check, when in the case of the British government, it's actually not even saying, we'd rather you didn't go. It's actually saying, we're really pleased that you're going, because we've got massive business deals going with Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not saying that it's okay that athletes do this. I'm just saying I don't hold it against them when they do. I'm not condoning anything. It's not really where I'm coming from. But you're right to point to these wider relations. In political science, we call it soft power, where governments are trying to exert power through some of these channels. And mega events have become one of those places where soft power is exerted. It allows countries like Saudi Arabia, like Minsk in Belarus that just hosted the European Olympics, to look important on the world stage, to do these sort of grin and grip photo ops with the world's cosmopolitan elite and look like they're just a regular country instead of a very oppressive one that's crushing the rights of their own people. And so that's where the power lies. And I think that's where the focus should be as well if we truly want to stop this kind of sport washing at the root.
Okay, so I know you want to make a point, but I've just got this question for both of you, for all three of you. Therefore, would it make any difference at all if 50 of the golfers said they weren't going to go, or the entire European tour said we're not going to go, and the TV companies didn't broadcast it? Would it make a jot of difference to a Saudi Arabian regime that still allows public executions, that still goes out and assassinates foreign journalists? Would it make any difference at all?
Well, I would, in what Jules was talking about, is exactly that they have this wonderful platform to promote the country as a wonderfully successful country, apart from anything else. That's important to them. And a country that has, if you like, normal relations with the rest of the world. And it's a way of saying we are accepted and taking, if you like, the spotlight away from the human rights issues and everything else.
You see, the thing is, it's realpolitik, isn't it? I mean, as long as Saudi Arabia gets arms deals with the United Kingdom, whether a bunch of golfers or sportsmen or women go there or not, it really doesn't make any difference. Unlike it did in South Africa, and we'll get to the difference in just a minute.
I think it's really important that when we look at why was the boycott in South Africa effective, and obviously there were many reasons, that apartheid came to an end, but clearly the sporting boycott was an impactful element of that. But it was because it was part of this wider push internationally. It was an unusual situation where almost all UN member states objected vociferously to the apartheid system. So the sporting boycott was kind of coming in on the back of that and was reasonably united. It was also linked to some specific egregious laws that could be changed and impacted directly on the sport. So there was a lot of things that were, I think, somewhat unique. I think, though, that, and I think the key point around today's sporting boycotts is that, yes, the bigger that they are, the more that they are united, the more impact they will have. I do think a country, Saudi Arabia is investing enormous amounts of money in building its soft power, its cultural power, and its connections. So if that isn't going to work, then that's a wasted investment, and it undermines the strategy. So I do think that it will matter.
Jules first, and then John. Tell me if you think I'm wrong on this one. I think some of the reason why there was the domino effect that James is talking about when it came to the ending of apartheid through various means was because there was a certain amount, Jules, if you like, of virtue signalling. Because one country said it was wrong, because one group said it was wrong, because another group said it was wrong, everybody then had to join in with the same chorus, and it became deafening, and therefore it blew down the walls of Jericho. But that won't happen with Saudi.
There's definitely a cascading effect in that particular instance. And I think there's definitely always more power among athletes when they act collectively. And even if all the golfers decided not to go to Saudi Arabia, we wouldn't see an instant change in policy in Saudi Arabia. And then people might say, oh, it doesn't matter. But I'm always reminded of the poet Robert Fitterman. He's a New York-based poet. He's got this great line that says, there are a lot of things that don't matter, and they add up. And I think we saw that in South Africa. You couldn't point to one specific particular thing that athletes or groups of people did, but in total, they add up and they put the necessary pressure on the government in South Africa, and that was a game changer. We don't know what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia, but by having golfers or whomever stand up collectively, we improve the chances that the pressure will increase on Saudi Arabia, and we might see a positive result in terms of human rights.
I suppose the answer to that is if you do nothing, nothing is going to change.
Yeah, and I think also there's an interesting bit that, particularly the Middle Eastern countries are not renowned for sport in any way. And therefore, it's a very, to me, blatant attempt to say, right, what we're after here is acceptance, publicity, worldwide stage projection. And if you take that away, at least they've got to go in a different direction
Just one final point. I said I'd mention this, John, towards the end of the programme. First of all, were you proud of the stand that you took? And secondly, were you perhaps a little bit ashamed that you didn't take it until you got back to the UK, having spent some enjoyable weeks on the rugby field in South Africa?
It was sort of a double thing. Yeah, I did feel, God, I really shouldn't have come here. I couldn't actually jack out. I mean, I could have done, but that would have been... So I had signed a deal that basically said, you're here for the 3 months and you won't talk politics while you're here either. So it would have been a mammoth thing to have done. But it also, I mean, in a way, going was the thing that absolutely gave me the information, all the background I needed to make a hard case when I came back.
Thank you very, very much indeed. George, thank you. James, thank you very much indeed. John Taylor, great to have you. I suppose the point that's been made by each one of the guests here today is that if you do nothing, nothing's going to change. But if you do something and somebody else does something and so on, then eventually things may well change for the better. Thank you for watching. Thank you for taking part. We hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now.